Welcome to our best practice video tutorials. This tutorial is on how to update the firmware on your Arecont Vision cameras. Alright, there are 7 steps to update your firmware. Download the firmware in the loader tool, launch the firmware loader tool, find the camera or cameras on the network, select the cameras to be updated, click the update button, browse to the firmware file location, and wait for the update to complete. Now I'm going to show you our webpage at www.arecontvision.com/firmware. Here you can find all current versions of firmware listed at the top of the page, as well as an archive section with older versions. You'll also find the firmware loader tool. Right-click, Save Target As, choose a directory on your PC to save it to, save it, wait for it to complete. Once you've downloaded the firmware loader tool, find the appropriate firmware. In this example, we're using a 5105DN, so we'll look for the appropriate firmware update tool. Choose a directory to download the firmware to. And when the download is complete, we go on to the next step. Okay, we're going to go ahead and launch the firmware loader tool. So we've done that, we're going to click Find Cameras. Any cameras in the local subnet will be found. We can see the MAC address, the IP address, and the hardware versions. Go ahead and select the cameras or cameras you want to update. Select Update Cameras, browse to the firmware location, click Open, and the download process of the firmware starts. There's a little progress bar we can watch at the top of the screen. While we're waiting for the firmware to update, I'd just like to emphasize one thing you do not want to do while you're updating the firmware is either disconnect the camera from the network or to disconnect power from the camera. Doing either of those two things could damage the camera. And look, we're successful. It was that easy. Alright, now I'm going to show you how to update camera firmware from a web page. If you have a panoramic camera, you have to use the firmware loader tool. But if you have a single sensor camera, you can go to the web page and update the firmware that way, one at a time as well. Under the About section, we can see the MAC address and firmware versions of the camera. Under the Administration tab, we can then find Browse next to Update Firmware. Browse to the location that we put our firmware. Where is it? Here we go. Select the firmware update we want to apply. Click Open, and then click the Upgrade button. You'll see this message reloading. Please wait. There'll be a warning that the camera is rebooting. Again, the same thing applies. Don't disconnect it from the network or disconnect the power. Go ahead, say OK. Wait a few minutes, and then refresh the web page. Take a moment. The web page will be visible a moment before the actual images. Once we can see an image, let's go to About. Confirm that the firmware update we applied has been applied. And we're done. It's that easy. Alright, I'm going to emphasize some potential issues. The loader tool may not be able to find cameras on other subnets. Broadcast traffic from the tool could interrupt other traffic on the network when finding cameras. Firewalls may interfere with the loader tool. Dual NICs may interfere with the loader tool. And again, powering off or disconnecting from the network during the update may damage the camera. So the 7 steps: download the firmware and loader tool, launch the firmware loader tool, find the camera or cameras on the network, select the cameras to be updated, click the update button, browse to the firmware file location, wait for the update to complete. It's that easy. Thanks for watching.